Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next of our 2023 CEBRA webinar series, or as we refer to them as CEBRAnars. My name's Richard Kane. I'm the Principal Director of the Innovation, Education and Research branch in Department of Agriculture. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today. For me, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on in Canberra, which is the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. And I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all other lands on which our staff and participants are gathered here today, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending today's excellent CEBRAnar. No pressure, Dr. Spring. Before we start, for everyone, I know we've just got Dr. Spring getting organised. If I can ask you to turn off your microphones and cameras. There'll be the opportunity for questions at the end. You can use the chat field as we go along if there's any particular questions that you would like answered. And just a reminder, I think Lisa's already started it, but we will be recording this as well for those that do want to review it later if you can't make it. So if you do have any issues, let us know now. Otherwise, move on. All right. For those of you, Danny, just one sec. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we've got the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, the CEBRA, which is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative, plays a vital role in providing the Australian and New Zealand government with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform a range of biosecurity risk management activities. Today, we are very lucky to be welcoming a CEBRA associate, Dr. Daniel Spring, who will discuss how introducing post-border adaptation measures or adaptation measures, such as the Compartment program, could potentially increase the resilience of Australia's animal biosecurity system and limit large losses to exporters. Dr. Spring is a researcher in the School of Ecosystem and Forest Science and has over 20 years' experience in teaching, research and consulting in environmental economics. His main focus has been to apply quantitative methods to apply practical solutions to complex policy problems, including how best to eradicate biological invasions and how to build connected reserve networks. Just before I do hand over to Dr. Spring, if I can ask or remind everyone to keep their microphones on mute, and I can see that presentation. So over to you, Dr. Spring. Thank you.
So welcome everybody, and thanks very much for this opportunity to speak with all of you, and there'll be an opportunity for everyone to discuss any slides that catch people's interest. I don't think it's controversial, but I'd like it to think that it's a little bit thought-provoking. It's a new biosecurity measure and it has not been implemented yet, and there's lots about it that needs to be discussed and people need to familiarise themselves with it. So for those reasons, I'm not going to just dive in and make any big statements about it. It's more of an information, just some background information and a few thoughts about how it might be used. Look, the aims of the presentation, there's a couple of legacy bits there. There's this country, our export markets, there's a few of them that require us to be free of disease in order for us to export there. And so if we get a disease that's trade limiting, then we can't export to some of these markets. We possibly can continue exporting to other markets. And whenever that happens, Australia suffers a loss and our exporters suffer a loss. And for that reason, we're considering compartmentalisation as an option to reduce the losses that that may happen in future if Australia gets new to trade limiting diseases. And what are we hoping to get out of this talk? Just to understand some of the differences between compartments and zones, which we already have. We already operate zones and we don't operate compartments. And I'm interested to and trying to explain some of the salient differences between compartments and zones to see if there's any advantages in compartments, in having compartments that are not there in zones. In talking about those advantages of compartments, I'm also going to talk about disadvantages compared to zones to help inform judgments about whether it's worth doing, whether it's worth implementing compartments in Australia. Some countries have compartments, and an interesting question, follow suit and do the same. So this is an example of, we start off by, the context here is that a lot of diseases that are not in Australia and which limit trade, a lot of those diseases are spreading globally. They're taking over more countries. So you can illustrate that on a map. And that's a comparison between 2017 and 2020, so only a 3-year difference, but you can see quite a big increase in the number of countries that are reported to have swine fever, African swine fever. So it's spreading and it's coming close to our doorstep. And as a planner, government agencies are charged with the responsibility of protecting countries from biosecurity threats. And they have among their portfolio of biosecurity measures some prevention measures, some measures that stop diseases arriving on our shores through trade, other measures that detect it on arrival and stop it getting in, and other measures that detect it soon after arrival and eradicate it before it gets a chance to spread far. So we also have zones for some animal diseases, but I think it's a fair statement, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, that most of Australia's national government biosecurity programs are focused on, at least with respect to animal diseases, is focused more on the prevention and early warning side than on the post-border side. And since compartments falls in under the category of a post-border measure, even though it's a preparedness measure, it would complement existing measures because there's not as much post-border measures as there are prevention and early detection. So hopefully that's not a controversial statement. So the absence of specific diseases in some of our markets are high, and how do I illustrate that? I've just drawn a black line around Japan and North America, and I'm saying that they are two countries or two sets of countries where we export to, and they're considered premium markets because of the high prices we can get there and the large volumes that we can export there for at least some animal products. Those countries don't have some diseases that we also don't have. And that means that if we were to get the disease before they do, we've got a problem because they won't let us export. So that's the type of scenario we're envisaging when we think about whether we should implement compartmentalisation. It's a scenario where our trading partners don't have the disease and we suddenly get it sometime in the future, and then we lose exports. We lose exports. And it costs producers and so on, all the problems that go with that. So those problems can be summarized by economists with the one word, cost. Breaks in market access, halts in market access to some countries is a cost to us. It's a lost opportunity to earn profits on exports. If we could estimate that cost somehow, we could work out the potential benefits of reducing that cost, or a benefit being defined as a reduction in that cost. So if we're losing on average $100 million a year from lost market access from diseases, or we could lose on average $100 million a year over the next 30 years from all the possible future diseases that might happen here, then that figure, that $100 million a year figure, is something we can work with. It's like as a baseline to work out how much we might gain from eliminating that cost or reducing it. So I think anybody who's interested in further considering compartments, it might be useful to start off by estimating what's the cost to Australia, the potential future cost to Australia of diseases that limit trade and which we don't have yet. Those costs not only include our lost exports during trading halts, those costs also include the things that we would have done but didn't do because of this risk of trading halts. One of the things we would have done potentially, if we had more reliable market access with less risk of trading halts, is to invest in bigger expanded production facilities. You know, we produce more. Aviogen, which is a chicken producer, might produce more chickens and set up production facilities to do that. And animal product processors might sort of set up more processing plants and so on. All of those additional investments might be currently held back by the risk of trading halts, but we don't know. It's hard to know that because it's not really observable, but you could get an insight into that by conducting surveys of producers to see which ones would invest more if they had more reliable export market access. So this could be an incorrect statement. The heading on this slide could be incorrect, and I always say that at the start of any slide where you need to gather a lot of data to be sure of the slide, but you say it anyway. I am making the big statement that Australia has a greater reliance on prevention and early detection of diseases than measures that facilitate trade during disease outbreaks. And if that's true, it has some implications. If, just to take an extreme case, and we're not referring to Australia now, just a hypothetical country. If you consider a hypothetical country that has all of its eggs in one basket in prevention and early response, but none on measures to facilitate trade during outbreaks, what would that look like? Well, a lot of things might be different. You might spend more on prevention. You might have more people employed at the border. You might have more surveillance infrastructure post-border. You might be more circumspect in allowing people to export to us because you really rely on diseases not arriving here. So, you know, we might have less imports. There's a lot of things that might be different in a world where we had nothing at our disposal to deal with the disease after it arrives, other than doing our best to eradicate it and our best to prevent it. If that's all we have, then we'll have less imports, potentially more post-border surveillance, probably more fear among producers, less investment. What else might there be? There might even be more and this one I'm interested in other people's. I'm flagging this as something that is a little bit controversial. Would we be destroying more animals and vaccinating more animals in a world where there's no post-border measures to facilitate trade during outbreaks? I don't know. But it's useful to reflect on these things because these are the things we'd consider when we're deciding whether to introduce compartmentalisation as a new biosecurity measure for Australia. So in thinking about a new measure, it's good to put it in the context of biosecurity system as a whole. Where does compartmentalisation fit within a national biosecurity system? And so this picture sort of is one way of illustrating that, and the next picture. It shows a solid green line, which is the do nothing line. And it shows how if there were no border controls and no controls of any sort by government, the only controls would be by producers doing the best they can in a world with more disease, you would get that solid green line at the top, and it rises steeply and then plateaus presumably once most of the people who could be harmed by disease already have been harmed, or presumably when most of the costs that arise from a disease have been incurred, and then it plateaus out. But if you do something to either delay an outbreak or shorten an outbreak, you get the dotted line. And biosecurity measures that delay or shorten outbreaks, so prevention measures delay outbreaks, and early warning measures shorten outbreaks. So, but we still haven't talked about measures that reduce our dependence on preventing and delay and shortening outbreaks. There's more to biosecurity than just preventing outbreaks and shortening them. You can allow people to trade during outbreaks, particularly if the disease we're looking at starts slow and it just creeps along, affecting a few producers and doesn't rapidly engulf a region or an industry. For the ones that don't rapidly engulf everybody and they move slowly, that might predispose you towards measures that allow you to trade during outbreaks, because there's plenty of people who aren't affected. But it's an open question whether a faster spreading disease is more amenable to compartmentalisation, or the benefits are bigger from compartmentalisation than a slow spreading disease. And I put that out there for discussion. I just sort of raise it. This is where you further reduce the cost of the cost to Australia of global animal disease. Diseases impose a threat to Australia, and the threat imposes several types of cost. One is the cost of mitigating the threat, and the other is the cost of dealing with the threat after your mitigation efforts fail. So you just add up those two costs, and that's the total cost of a disease threat. And so compartments do reduce that cost. How do they do it? Well, they don't stop it getting in, and they don't even probably slow it spreading. You would have to have a lot of producers becoming compartments in order for compartmentalisation to slow spread. And I'm not even sure if zones, which are a bigger thing than a compartment, it's got more producers in a zone than a compartment. I'm not even sure if zones slow spread. If ASF would arrive in Australia, would zones slow its spread? Or if foot and mouth disease were to arrive in Australia, would zones slow its spread? I don't know. But it's possible it wouldn't, just because the contact network involving sale yards and online sales of animals and all of the other things that bring animals into contact with disease-carrying kind of vectors, because that contact network is so dense and it's got so many connections, it's hard to imagine just removing a small part of that network from the network will make the rest of the network, make the disease spread much more slowly across the rest of that network. So what we're talking about here is not slowing spread. That red line is not, I guess that was a long-winded way of saying that I don't think that the red line being lower than the black line is because it slowed spread. It's because a few of the high-valued producers who otherwise would have just stopped producing, would have had to dump their product on this domestic market or destroy it, get to keep selling it. That's all the red line. That's why the red line's lower than the black dotted line. And the pink area is the cost you've avoided by having a biosecurity system. And where does compartments fit within all this? Well, I've sort of hinted at that already. Zones and compartments are both post-mortem measures that allow people to trade during outbreaks. There's a difference. One's a geographic separation and the other one's more of a production system design separation. You design your production systems and your supply chains so that they are insulated from the rest of the spatial contact network, you could call it, which is the network that spreads diseases. Some people call it an epidemiological network, but it's got so many syllables in that word that I hesitate to use it. So, but it's more of a functional type of separation, whereas zones are more of a geographic type of separation. The main thing to note about them is that if you're in a zone or if you're in a compartment and you're a producer, you have a smaller chance of catching a disease in your area, and you also have other benefits which we'll talk about, such as it's easier to demonstrate that the disease is absent from your system than it is for any other producer. It's also easier to confirm that it's absent in your system after you've had an outbreak than any other system. It's got a lot of things going for it. So these things are designed to really work well. And people recognise that they work well, and it's so well recognised internationally that the OIE, which is no longer called the OIE, which shows you that I'm a little bit behind the times, but it's so well recognised that compartments can work well and zones can work well under the right circumstances, that they've drawn up guidelines for how you should design it so that they do work well. And there's the terrestrial code. Sets out a whole lot of principles about how you should design a compartment. Now, this is just saying what I said, so I'll skip it. Otherwise, we'll run out of time. But it's I've already had a chat about that, so we'll move on. And we've all also talked about this slide a bit because we're saying if in a country that has zones, lots of zones and lots of compartments. And by the way, why would you consider having both zones and compartments? Are they perfect substitutes for each other? Does it make, if you had zones, does that completely remove the need to have, or the benefits of having compartments? And the answer is no, they're not perfect substitutes. And so we're going to have a slide in about 2 or 3 slides showing some of the differences between them. They're not perfect substitutes, and that means any country that wants to optimize its portfolio of risk management by having a suite of risk management measures, including border protection and early warning and post-border trade facilitation. If you want to have the best mix of them, you'd probably have zones and compartments. But I have to be mindful that we have not done really detailed cost-benefit analyses of zones, or certainly not of compartments. And I'm going to make a point later on that we don't need cost-benefit analyses of compartments. We should just do them anyway. One argument could be made, we should do them even without cost-benefit analyses, which is not true of zones. Since I've made a big statement, I should quickly back it up before I move to the next slide. Compartmentalisation is entirely voluntary. Producers do not have to sign up to become a compartment and incur the costs of doing it. They would only, if they're properly informed about the pros and cons of becoming a compartment, and they still decide to become a compartment, and they spend money to do that, you have to assume that they're well informed and their reasons are sound, and they're going to benefit more than it costs them. So there's no need to do a cost-benefit analysis for any purely voluntary biosecurity measure, provided that the people who incur the costs of that measure are informed. On the other hand, with zones, some people, I'm not sure if this is true, some of the members are, I'm not sure if there's any compulsion with zoning. So if any measure that involves compulsion has to have a cost-benefit analysis, because basically Western democracies don't like to force people into doing anything without giving good reasons for it, that it benefits the greater community. I think that's probably, but I might have missed something on that. So that does sound a little bit controversial, and I'm going to have to be careful not to say anything too controversial, but I like to sort of raise issues. So let's talk a bit more about compartmentalisation. There's a bit of a history of it. In 1993, the concept was aired and this terrestrial code was drafted. 10 years later, we had the aquatic codes as well, and avian flu checklist of things that need to be done to create a compartment. And that happened in 2007. So things are chugging along. Things are chugging along nicely, and you can see how it's evolving just by looking at that timeline. It's a sequence of things of expanding the code to include new industries, in this case aquatic in 2003. It's other changes that tend to happen are they refine the checklist, they talk, because this is a collaborative process where industry is involved. It's not just government imposing dictates from above. It's very collaborative, and naturally, as with any set of rules, any set of adaptive and good rules, for it to be adaptive, it needs to change over time as new information comes in and threats change and so on. And that's reflected in that timeline, and that's an incomplete timeline because I'm sure some important things have happened since 2019. So we can just, it's always good when you're talking about a new biosecurity measure to illustrate it with respect to something specific, something tangible. In this case, it's going to be African swine fever. And then that's topical because it's it is a threat to Australia. We don't have it yet, but it could arrive here because it's, from the map I showed earlier, it's spreading. So there are guidelines on how to compartmentalise for that disease. And what it takes to implement it and be recognised that you have a bona fide compartment. And it's described in bulletins and so on. Official bulletins of the OIE. Let's talk about some of the differences between compartments and zones. And it's not a one size fits all. There's roles for both of them. I'm saying that right up front. This is not to say that one's better than, here's a checklist and one of them's better. It's not about that. It's about showing differences. So one of the questions, and I'm not too sure about this, so there are people in the audience who know more about this than me, not only about this, but about a lot of things to do with compartmentalisation. And is it true that zones tend to get established? I mean, I've seen there are lots of zones that are established before diseases arrive, but I'm not sure how many of Australia's zones for specific diseases were established after the disease arrived versus before. But according to this, the information I gathered for this presentation, which is all additional information that was gathered after the original CEBRA report, and I should have mentioned this right at the start of the presentation, that CEBRA was commissioned by the Australian government to write a report evaluating compartmentalisation as a biosecurity measure, and they completed that report and made findings on about the pros and cons of compartmentalisation. And these slides draw on the main findings of that report, but it also adds a little bit of new material that was not in that report. So apologies to CEBRA really for not having acknowledged that they did. I consider it to be one of the early evaluations of compartmentalisation for Australia, because I haven't seen any sort of economic evaluations of compartmentalisation for Australia before that report. There may have been. So compartments can be set up long before a disease reaches here, and this is really important. And I'll talk about this really briefly now. The ability to set up a compartment years before a disease is very important, because it means it's a preparedness measure. So let's go back to a picture so we can illustrate why early compartmentalisation fits the definition of a preparedness measure. Okay, well, let's just use this one. Imagine that the disease hasn't arrived here, so we're to the left of that diagram. And we set up compartmentalisation for all pig, animal and pork product producers. And whoever wants to become a compartment signs up and become compartments. And then swine fever reaches Australia 10 years later. And because we've negotiated with our trading partners agreements to accept Australian pig products exports, if and when we get a swine fever outbreak, because we've negotiated those agreements years before the outbreak, it means that when the outbreak happens, we just continue, we don't skip a beat, exports continue. And so it fits the definition of a preparedness measure, because you do something before an outbreak, and when the outbreak happens, the cost is smaller. And I don't want to get too philosophical, even though I don't want to get too philosophical, but it means stopping diseases coming in when you've got lots of potential entry points for diseases and lots of potential vectors is a really challenging problem, and hard to confirm how many diseases you've stopped arriving, how long you've delayed outbreaks. It's really hard to do all that. Whereas, and the fact that it's so hard to know how much you're achieving with prevention makes it a slightly risky biosecurity measure, because you can't put your finger on it and say, I'm going to delay on average every single major trade limiting disease by 20 years. You can't say that. Whereas compartmentalisation, if we negotiate agreements with Japan and the US and Canada and premium markets, if we negotiate agreements with them now, and enough producers sign up to become compartments, we do know that if the disease comes here, we don't know with certainty, but we are quite confident that we will avoid some trade losses. So it's got that, I mean, I don't want to labour the point, but it feels like it's a good risk management measure because of that level of confidence that if something happened, you're pretty confident that something good will happen. I should say I'm not used to giving long presentations. I normally say a couple of things and other people say something else, and then I like to tick along discussions in that way. So I'm not quite sure if I'm labouring points. So somebody should feel free to say, Danny, cut some things short.
You're all good, Danny. You've got about 10 or 15 minutes before we throw it open to some questions. But no, okay. Very good, very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to cut this short. Zones and compartments are different. Zones get created after the disease, sometimes at least, I think, and compartments can be long before. The other good thing about a compartment is you can negotiate a compartment agreement with a country, and that covers anybody who becomes a compartment later. You don't have to do individual agreements with each producer. So you've got all these economies of scale in trade negotiations. And yeah, so there's lots of good things about it. And that's really it for that slide. Other differences. You could argue that zones don't do as well in terms of giving that shared responsibility paradigm as compartments. Why? Because if you want to become a compartment, you've got to front up the money to become one, all the costs in changing your premises and your production practices to make them compliant with the guidelines. If you want to incur those costs, you're putting your money where your mouth is and you're saying, I believe I can do this. I believe I can become a safe trader. And I'm willing to spend money to prove that, provided I get a chance to export during a disease outbreak. And if you look at avian flu, it happens every few years or on average, and I don't want to lose export market access the next time it happens. I'm going to lose $10 or $20 million. So I'm happy to spend a couple of million or even $500,000, whatever it takes, to ensure myself against lost market access. So, and I also recognise I'm going to be audited by the government. They're going to check whether I'm doing what I said I'm doing. And that's a system which sounds like strong incentives to spend on biosecurity and do a good job. Whereas zoning is quite different. If there's any compulsion at all from some producers in a zone to join a zone, then, and you've got many producers in a zone, then automatically one producer's actions helps a lot of other producers. And it means that some people might become free riders and just not put in a big effort. Unless each individual producer in a zone is audited and with the same intensity that a compartment is, and I don't know if that's true. you know, if they get audited less sort of rigorously, individual producers within a zone than a compartment, then who's to say that some producers within a zone will do less on biosecurity? And if that's true, then that it's less compatible with the shared responsibility paradigm. So anyway, just putting that out there. Now, there's another difference between zones and compartments that's in that. If the Australian government is going to negotiate on behalf of producers to allow free continued exports during an outbreak, then if they negotiate on behalf of a zone, they're negotiating on behalf of more producers than if they negotiate on behalf of one on an industry that's compartmentalised with only one compartment in it. So let's assume Aviogen is the only producer in the poultry export industry that wants to become a compartment. And the Australian government then goes ahead and negotiates a market access agreement with the US to allow Aviogen to export. It's sort of like a client service model where you've got one person wanting something and the government acting on behalf of one producer. Whereas if a zone agreement is negotiated with the US, they're doing on behalf of potentially tens or even hundreds of producers. So you might say, well, I think given scarce resources for negotiation, if there is such a thing as limited resources to do trade negotiations, or if reaching an agreement with an export market on one matter reduces your leverage or bargaining power on another matter, so there's only so many agreements you can negotiate in a given period without stretching the friendship too much or something like that. You might say, let's negotiate on behalf of zones and really not negotiate on behalf of compartments. But the first thing I would look at on that question would be, let's look at global data on countries that have both zones and compartments, and they got a disease. So I don't know if there are any countries that exist like that, but a country that has zones and compartments and a new trade limiting disease. In those countries, did the disease reach a zone before it reached a compartment? Because you would think it's more likely that zones are going to get a disease than a compartment, but maybe they're equally well protected. But my gut feeling is they're harder to protect a zone from a national disease than a compartment. I'm happy to be corrected on that. It's because of the time limiting. There's not many compartments internationally, so that's another issue. This is reasonably new, so lots to think about. Newcastle disease and AI compartments. You've got Aviogen. Aviogen was a company that we spoke with at CEBRA when we wrote our report, and they're very keen for Australia to set up a compartment for their Australian production facilities to become compartmentalised. They are very keen to do that because they see export market benefits to them from doing that. Foot and mouth disease discussions are ongoing between, say, Uruguay and the US about setting up compartments for foot and mouth disease. So you could potentially be extended to cattle industries. ASF is one that is discussed. There's an illustration of it. You know, you hive off an area, or you set up a vertically. The question then for people with expertise in pig production, which have much more expertise than I do, will know what the ins and outs are of separating your production facilities from the rest of the spatial contact network. And that's the right figure on that diagram. So you have a biosecurity plan for an ASF compartment. You have a way of separating yourself from the rest of the network. You've got a sanitation plan. You've got a traceability system. There's a lot of things in a compartment that make them work really well as a biosecurity measure. And that's some of the details on what you need to do to become a compartment. And because that's quite detailed and we won't have time, I'm going to skip that. But if anybody wants to refer back to it in question time, we can do it then. Epidemiological separation. Bunch of things you have to do. You've got to keep the place clean. You've got to have traceability. You've got to keep good records to make sure if you do get a disease, you can trace back where you got it and that sort of thing. So these are a summary of some of the main things you need to do to become certified by the Australian government as a compartment. Vertically integrated systems tend to be easier to just sort of control, I guess, and manage. And there are stakeholders, and there's producers, and there's others on the supply chain. There are other people that you'd need to engage with. And so on. Then the Australian government needs to negotiate with premium export markets to allow us to export to them during a disease. And that requires international discussions and agreements. And they need to trust our competent authority. They need to trust our system. A lot of things have to happen. But Australia, because it has a good sort of a exemplary record in safe production of animal products, you would think that puts us in a good position to enter into those negotiations. I mean, a challenge is that a lot of countries aren't familiar with it and they'll be reluctant to just jump into it. They need to really familiarise themselves with it and think there's ins and outs and things could go wrong. And that's going to create hesitancy in export markets to sign agreements. All of those benefits, you get to trade during outbreaks, but it's not just that. People might invest more and we get more, we might export more. I don't know if this is true, but I think a lot of Australia's agricultural industry growth plans, which has been a feature of the Australian political landscape for decades, is to look at to take advantage of any good opportunities to expand Australian agriculture. And we're a large country with a lot of land. If you were to fully exploit all of our opportunities for agricultural expansion, a lot of those expansion opportunities would be geared towards export industries. And that might make compartmentalisation more important if we want to expand agriculture. And I'll just finish on something controversial because it wouldn't be one of my presentations without saying something a little bit new or a little bit controversial, I suppose. I know that Andrew Robinson will be really surprised to hear that because he's of the view that I'm probably one of the most conservative people he knows, and I'll never put a foot wrong on any matter. Sorry. Anyway, you could extend it to domestic trade so that nobody in Victoria, Victorians won't buy New South Wales poultry during a Newcastle disease or an avian flu outbreak in New South Wales that hasn't yet reached Victoria. If we did that, it's possible that would strengthen our credibility when entering into international negotiations to form new to reach trade agreements with export markets. Why? Because if we've got a track record of successful application of compartmentalisation domestically, all the required skills that are needed for that are also required for export certification. So, and the number of producers who export from New South Wales to Victoria is much larger than the number of producers in New South Wales who export internationally, and therefore the number of producers who would sign up for compartmentalisation might go up exponentially if you introduce domestic compartmentalisation. So it's something that's worth thinking about. It strengthens our international bona fides and it might increase the number of producers who invest in biosecurity and share the biosecurity responsibilities. So I thought that was a bit controversial. I don't know. So key message is that both zoning compartmentalisation are options for preparedness, although more so compartmentalisation because you can do it years in advance. And they can do great things if it's done right and if trading partners agree, and there's a lot of ifs. And so it's it's useful to explore those ifs because of the potential benefits. And I'd like to leave it there because I don't think there's anything more particularly that I really, given the time available, that I want to cover. Is that okay if I leave it there, or did you want me to keep talking?
Excellent. No, really good. I know it's hard when everyone's got the cameras off, but thank you for a very thought-provoking and at times controversial sort of discussion on compartments and I guess, the options that could be applied between that and zoning as a biosecurity risk management strategy. But While you've been going along, there's been a lot of questions, and noting the time, I'll try and get through them as quick as I can for you. If we do get through those, I'll get people to throw up their hands. The first one was from Jeffrey Robinson, and he said, Danny, do you think it encourages producers to be more biosecurity aware?
Well, I missed part of the question. Something encourages producers to do more biosecurity, but I missed the rest of it.
Apologies. Do you think it encourages producers to be more biosecurity aware?
I think it would not encourage producers to be more biosecurity aware if it's just an export compartmentalisation scheme, because the only producers, because it's a voluntary scheme and people have to voluntarily sign up, request to become certified. The ones who are going to request being certified are already aware of biosecurity matters, I'm assuming, whereas the people who aren't aware of biosecurity matters won't be interested in the scheme anyway, and they have nothing to gain from becoming more biosecurity aware, other than what they already have to gain from being biosecurity aware. On the other hand, if it was a domestic compartmentalisation scheme and you've got people who suddenly can't sell somewhere, then they will have an incentive to learn about biosecurity. Now, they'll ask questions such as, how much is it going to cost me to access Victoria? And if the answer is not much compared to how much extra sales I'd make, they'd probably do it.
Very good. I've got a few coming through here. So I'm just going to do, it's in the chat field if you're having trouble hearing me, Danny.
Yep.
This is from Janine saying, keen to know which countries already use compartmentalisation, and have there been any disease outbreaks that have allowed a full assessment of the benefits that compartments have delivered to them?
That's a great question. And it's exactly the question I would ask if somebody was going to do a follow-up study to our CEBRA report. And because I haven't been in touch with compartmentalisation that much since that report, I can't answer it. And I feel bad about that because it's such a good question. But it's the right question to ask. If anyone else in the audience has an answer to that, though, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, is that Ashley Jordan? Is that far away, mate?
That's me. So I put it in the chat, but there's a couple of poultry compartments for HPAI and some other diseases. The UK one, which Australia did recognise for imports of hatching eggs, for instance, that broke down during the most recent HPAI outbreaks in UK. So unfortunately, that wasn't a success, or at least thus far hasn't been. The US has one for HPAI and a number of other diseases. I'm fairly sure they've had breakdowns in that compartment scheme as well for HPAI. And then Canada's in the process of setting up one, which was initially largely industry driven for ASF. But that's been a number of years in the making. I don't think they've got to the point of negotiating recognition with trading partners. Thanks.
That's interesting. That's great. I mean, it's informative. So what's your take on it? Is that saying that in some countries there was a disease and the compartment wasn't able to export because it wasn't able to demonstrate freedom?
Yeah, so the compartments broke down. Some of the producers that were part of the scheme had outbreaks. And so once that happens, all the producers in the scheme lose market access. And so, at least in those cases, it can't really be considered a success for international trade. I think the concept of compartmentalisation is great, and there's certainly its uses, but bottom line is it needs to, trading partners will be outcomes focused, and if there's an outbreak within the compartment, it loses its status and probably the credibility to a degree.
Would you say this is a critical question for the potential to adapt compartments and improve them over time? Would you say that the failings that happened in those cases are fixable and learnable? In other words, is it sort of can you overcome? Is it part of a learning process where everything that seems to have gone wrong so far is fixable with changed standards, changed OIE standards?
I don't think it'll change WOA standards necessarily, but yeah, there'll certainly be a review process and an improvement in the UK, provided they the government supports, maintaining that program, which, as far as I'm aware, they do. Yeah, and there's certain things about HPAI which make it difficult to control. But if there's any outdoor component of the poultry systems and they have contact with wild birds, then that's, I believe, where they've seen the breakdowns. But I'm not close enough to it to know what their intention is going forward.
Okay.
Danny, Jordan, I'll dive in if I may. I'm reasonably close to it. So the compartments worked whilst the compartments were free. So we continued to get imports into Australia for 18 months before the break. We've had a cessation of imports. It looks like we're going to be able to import again in October this year, because to your question, Danny, they did learn some lessons from the infrastructure they had and then what they needed to do to prevent because the break was actually quite simple in terms of how it happened.
That's good. That's great.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we tell our kids fixable problems. Making mistakes is no problem if you learn from them, and fixable problems are great to learn from.
Yeah, no, it's expensive when you make a mistake, but and it's a disruption to supply, and it disrupted avian supply into lots of places around the world because lots of people depended upon that compartment. But that compartment was vital for the 5 or 6 or 7 years leading up to it, with the various outbreaks of AI in the UK.
Yes.
Because everybody had continuity of supply. And it's interesting about risk appetite. We were actually able to, the MPI in New Zealand were happy to still take it with the compartment breaking down, provided they went from clean farms, because the risk is yours.
And presumably you made enough money over the preceding 7 years before the outbreak that covers your costs of the temporary hold during the outbreak.
That makes no sense if you don't.
Well, yes, that's right. So so far we haven't seen any evidence that it's not cost beneficial. We're having evidence that occasionally they break down, but those breakdowns are infrequent enough that they still pay off.
Yeah, and they get a better compartment when they've learned their lesson.
I think that's a really good point. And just noting the time, Danny, because there has been a few other questions, so I'll try and get through a couple. Apologies. Les has put in here, becoming or having a compartmentalisation is voluntary, but is there some kind of registration process? And related to this, do compartmentalisations become information artefacts, portable, easy to find, reusable in new context, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, because it's a guideline-based system, it follows guidelines, and you can have slight modifications to the guidelines as long as you don't water them down. You can go beyond them, or you can make modifications so long as they're in agreement with the certifier and your trading partner that you're negotiating with. Then you can give you a bit of flexibility, and so any degree of flexibility reduces the question you're talking about is portability of a regulatory system or a regulatory instrument such as a certificate. It's still portable because 90% of its content is set out in guidelines that's internationally recognised.
I'm going to skip Andrew Robertson's question, but that sounds like another CEBRA project, Andrew, and I agree with that one. Vivian has just put in here, noting that compartments can be set up years in advance of an outbreak. Would there need to be an ongoing process of assessing and maintaining the registration status of those that are registered, as their practices or supply changes, as their practices and supply chains could change or evolve over time?
Really good question, and I think others in the audience who are familiar with compartments and the regulatory side would be able to answer that. But my understanding is there's periodic audits. I don't know if it's annual. I'm just not too sure how frequent. And that's another question: is what's the optimal frequency of audits? But bear in mind that if they produce and they export without having done a careful job of auditing their own premises, they are the biggest losers from that. And so they have a strong incentive to do that. But government also has the risk of reputational loss because they have negotiated this market access agreement. If consignments get sent with carrying disease and it's been audited by the relevant authorities, then that's a lot of parties lose out of that. But I think that gives everybody incentive to do proper auditing.
Look, Dr. Spring, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I hope people got a lot out of it. And just a special mention to Ashley Jordan. He's put in quite a few comments there and given a couple of links as well on Canada, who are setting up an ASF compartment scheme. So lots of conversation that is going on through in the chat. We will attempt to try and cover off those questions as they go through. But thank you, Dr. Spring, for your presentation today, and everyone who attended this CEBRAnar. The recording will be sent out in due course. Just a reminder for everyone that the next one is scheduled for Thursday, 31 August, and we've got Associate Professor Susie Hester, who's going to be talking about European wasp management. I look forward to you joining us all then. Until then, thank you very much for joining us here today, and thank you, Dr. Spring.
Thanks, everybody.